Absolutism. It's all a God thing. There have only been three monarchs in history that did not need some account of accountability for their actions. That's because God created Adam and Eve perfectly without sin, and Jesus has always been perfect and the ultimate king of the universe. Kings and popes were never part of God's original plan for his people or for the earth. They were certainly never perfect enough in their decisions or motives to not require some amount of accountability for their actions on the earth. Even though kings were not part of God's original plan, government was, as the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 13 through 4. No matter how cruel Roman Empire was to the church, Christians were still expected to obey all the laws up to the ones that required them to violate God's word. For the kings of Europe during the Napoleonic era, the story of absolutism being a God thing began with the Roman Empire, especially with the rule of Julius Caesar and Octavian. Caesar ended obedience to the Senate, and Octavian took on the title Augustus, which meant to be worshipped as a god. Caesar would also come to be the head of all religions in Rome, meaning everyone in the empire needed to obey him, and there was no one on the earth that could challenge his authority. Constantine's conversion to Christianity and his activity at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE did not lessen the absolute nature of the Roman emperor or the connections with religion. In both the eastern and western parts of the empire, there was no one whom the emperor was accountable to. He was God's ordained leader, and he alone could hear from heaven what the correct policy was. The absolute power of European monarchs obviously took a massive hit with the fall of Rome in 476. With the rise of political authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church in Rome, monarchs struggled to regain any kind of power and legitimate footing to rule in the way of the great Roman emperors. This is until Charlemagne began to carve out a massive empire in Central Europe in the late 8th century. This newfound powerful ruler got Rome's attention, and on Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of all the Romans. This title would become better known as the Holy Roman Emperor. Though he made many positive changes in education and religion of the empire, Charlemagne was still the unquestioned authority that was not to be challenged. Over the next several centuries, as Western Europe slowly grew out of the challenges of the Dark Ages and the upheaval known as the Crusades, modern nation states such as England, France, and Spain began to form, and conflict between the kings and the popes continued over issues such as lay investiture and the two swords theory that gave the pope huge amounts of power. But in spite of this conflict, the papacy needed the kings, and the kings needed the church. The ability to rule without question was only possible because people believed that the system they lived under was God's design, and that to question either the king or the pope would mean a straight ticket to hell for all eternity. The divine right of kings was seen across the continent, especially in the century leading up to the French Revolution, and rulers like Louis XIV in France, Peter the Great in Russia, and James I in England. No matter how extravagant or extreme their actions or reforms were, few were willing to challenge the king openly. In the end, it all comes down to one thing: glory and power. One of the most discussed aspects of Napoleon's life is his crowning himself king in 1804 and then invading more and more nations around France to spread and safeguard the reforms of his Code Napoleon. Napoleon led his nation from glorious victory to glorious victory. The people of France became so addicted to the glory they seemed to be able to ignore Napoleon's policies were taking France further and further away from the intent of the revolution. As a student of history, a low-level nobleman from Corsica, and a genius on so many levels, it was easy for Napoleon to succumb to the allure and addiction of power. It did not seem to be in his character to walk away from total power, the lure of absolute glory. So he did what all men who crave ultimate power do: they took their godhood to the grave with them.